Hello, welcome back. Here's the first episode of the series to take place in Season 14 of Lounge. Before I say a single thing, I'm sure you all noticed the video length. I figure I may as well preface this extravaganza that is my first and hopefully last double feature by delivering a post-mortem on my performance in the previous season. Season 13 was actually my most successful in quite a while, despite the fact I continue to play sporadically and mostly infrequently, which has been a general pattern of behavior of mine for quite a while. In spite of that, though, I actually saw the most success in quite a while, which I can primarily attribute to the fact I played just about every special event and tournament last season. I would have only ended up at around High Sapphire, which was the second to last rank before Master, but on the last day of the season I played a 32-track event and barely managed to scrape Diamond, which I was quite happy about. With that in mind, though, Season 13 was one of the most inflated seasons on record across both track types, thereby compelling staff to take a reactionary approach to ranks this season. To that end, the MMR ranges are much more stringent and there's now an additional rank, so needless to say, I don't expect the same success as last time. Regardless, as I said, I'm satisfied given my comparatively low event count. It's hard to tell if I've improved since I play so few events in a state of what I'd personally considered fully warmed up. But whenever I was in such a state while playing an event last season, I maintained a standard of gameplay that I was pretty proud of. Considering that my attainment of Diamond can be easily attributed to inflation, I fall back upon my average as a metric of actual quantifiable improvement, and for once it's closer to 80 than 75, but only if you round up, seeing as it was a 77.5. Not impressive by any means, so feel free to steal the idea for this series if you're better at the game than I am. I've noticed multiple people doing their own live commentated series in the past few months, which is great to see. Anyways, that about wraps up my synopsis of last season, so I'll first address the elephant in the room before introducing the nominal topic. MK9 will be the subject of the next video because given my commentary release schedule, it'll end up being uploaded around the time of the game's release. I do already have enough in mind to cover a half-hour time span, but it could end up being the case that I synthesize further insights over the course of now to then. Another reason why is that it'll probably end up being at least slightly reminiscent of the episode 4 situation where I talked about something that I don't necessarily consider to be within the scope of my preferred range of topics, but was rather sort of prompted unto me while only having a vestigial connection to my own inner sphere of original thought. Although for next episode I believe I'll have some worthwhile musings. As for this video, though, I'm announcing for the second time in 2 episodes that I'm starting a new sub-series once again. Whereas the scope of Still Mad About is exclusively within MKW, this one will take a broader approach by nature and allow me to veer off of MKW-related topics for even proportionally longer than I normally do without feeling like I'm misdirecting people who click my videos for MKW specifically. My penchant to compare phenomena that I witness in MKW to the trends within the multitude of communities that I've observed in the past was always going to be an integral part of my commentaries because it's an ever-present aspect of my thought process. But in this sub-series, the general idea is that I won't at all hold back on detailing the circumstances of communities that are barely related to MKW if I think it contributes to the topic at hand. On that note, welcome to the MKW versus Other Games sub-series. For this inaugural entry, I'll be continuing upon the sociological theme from last episode, but with an idea that is less tangible and thereby harder to conceptually track. This episode's theme is how toxicity is handled in the MKW community and where it comes from on a cultural level. With most of my topics, I have a general idea as to how I'd like to structure them, but I don't have that kind of mental roadmap in mind for this video, so I'll just start with a theory that I feel needs to be put onto the table first in order to get insight into my line of thought regarding this topic. It's something I've touched upon multiple times already, and an adjacent concept will also be a cornerstone of what I'll get into in the MK9 video, so I'll come off as quite the broken record here for those of you who are familiar with my approach to sociology from previous commentaries. Nevertheless, it is not just essential to understanding this particular video's topic, and thereby bears repeating for the umpteenth time, but is also the cornerstone of this overarching idea I'll be exploring here. On the internet, culture is fleeting and inherently transient. There's no guarantee that the ideas associated with the overhead of the internet will stick around. They could embed themselves into broader internet discussion, fade away completely, or end up somewhere in between. What I mean when I say overhead are the ideas that even those who define themselves primarily as members of internet subcultures, as opposed to mere loyaltyless denizens of the breadth of internet culture, which may seem impossible to define at first, but a clear image of which you'll be able to visualize by having me invoke the pseudo-intellectual, uncapitalized sentence fragments you see on Twitter with 400,000 likes whenever you happen to get randomly logged out, still have to contend with the prevailing regime culture that is propagated by the cosmopolitan masses. You may have never played Undertale's pacifist route or read fan fiction on Tumblr, but your brain has still subconsciously developed the mechanisms to interact with the kinds of people who have, because culture as a whole has been ultimately subservient to the ideas proliferated by that category of people for give or take the past decade. Even if you were to, theoretically, exclusively spend your time online in MKW-related communities, you would still only be getting an idea of MKW culture in equal part with an instinctually ascertained facsimile of the sensibilities of the contemporary internet as a whole. And that's not to even mention the element of adjacent cultures like the MKW community's latent connections to games like Melee, SM64, or a more modern game like Splatoon, which I'll get into later. The culture of any given community, but in this case the MKW community, can fundamentally be thought of as attempting to retain a given set of values while being acted upon constantly by other cultural forces with no regard for what those values may be. There are a lot of places this could go, but I'm going to narrow this down into just one aspect: toxicity. With the question of the hour being, what differentiates the MKW community's toxicity from other communities, such as ones for other Nintendo games, and what leads each community to maintain the relationship with toxicity that it does? As I said, when it comes to an internet subculture, be it a fandom, a forum, or just a more generally defined gaming community, the values intrinsic to that community will be under attack, so to speak, from the predominant cultural forces that the community's members bring with them throughout their day-to-day interactions in that subcommunity. You can imagine these categorically socialized normie ideas as sort of cultural microbes in a Dostoevskian sense. However, for most communities, this hardly really occurs and isn't worth overanalyzing, because most communities have no sense of being chronologically removed from pop culture. Fortnite players might get nostalgic for the good old days of Ball Meadow or back when Kaizui used to play or whatever, but they're all still just teenage culture drones who don't have an inherent reason to be nostalgic. In their eyes, peak Fortnite is merely an OG update and the return of a few lit streamers away from existing once again just as it always had. On the other hand, in the MKW community, and especially in my own head because I've always been like this, there's much more of a tangible sense of romanticism when viewing past eras of players, clans, tracks, and CTGP. It's thought of in this wistful kind of what's done is done sense, like all we can hope to do is look back in appreciation of greater eras without the chance of actually reclaiming the vitalism of them. It's something I, at least, feel very strongly about and have gotten glimpses of in conversations with others, so I'll assume that it's not just a me thing. The critical difference is that MKW is not a game that I perceive as maintaining any relation to contemporary pop culture, for a multitude of reasons. This is also something I observe in other old games like the original Modern Warfare 2, which is pathetic I even have to specify, fuck all new CODs, as well as games like old school RuneScape, Minecraft 1.7 PvP, which is somehow still alive, and even Geometry Dash to an admittedly limited extent. From these communities, I perceive two factors that sociologically serve as predicting markers for the critical and hopefully somewhat quantifiable principle of how well a community resists the naturally subversive forces of the overarching culture of the time, of the broader milieu, and preserves the unique aspects of its own culture, a factor which I'll call cultural reticency. I know it's not the right word, but whatever. A community possessing a high degree of cultural reticency does not necessarily make it inherently interesting, but when it possesses that reticency in tandem with an interesting culture, especially one that exists in opposition to the norms and mannerisms of the overculture, it gains the potential to shine far proportionally brighter than other subcultures that merely sway with the wind of whatever sensibilities are in vogue in a given time period. Before I delve into the factors conducive to this concept, I want to enumerate a case study that represents both ends of this cultural preservation spectrum. And for that, I'll return to GD once again, since I stated that GD players' ability to successfully preserve their culture is only an incidental community phenomenon. When it comes to the GD community as a whole, barely any sense of respect is truly given to the ways in which the community used to formerly operate on a behavioral level. Lip service is paid to the players and creators of the 2010s, but no effort is made to consider what attitudes or customs they may have had. It's a real shame, too, because up until recently I had always perceived the GD community as being sort of chronologically removed from the broader internet's mannerisms and attitudes. 5 years behind the world was how I phrased it to myself, but that seems to have evaporated now, seeing as the game received its biggest update ever in late 2023 and was thrust into the spotlight of the overculture, thereby serving to exacerbate the sociological modernization it was already in the midst of. But general population GD drones who don't play the game competitively have only ever demonstrated a narrow sense of cultural reticency anyways, even at the height of the sentiment. The salient category of players worth mentioning here is the competitive crowd. I talked about the challenge list in episode 7, but when it comes to this phenomenon, challenge list players are actually quite pathetic. They've only existed on a noteworthy scale for a few years in the grand scheme of things, so you'll end up seeing double-take-inducing shit like people being nostalgic for 2022, which is the kind of I'm 14 and this is deep sentimentality that serves to discredit the teleology of wanting to exist within a non-contemporary cultural milieu in the first place, hence why I feel the need to disavow it. I find these kinds of people so laughable that I've even started to parody them and their MKW equivalents, like with my 2021 CT pack meme. In that sense, traditional competitive GD players, i.e. longtime demonless grinders, are far better at defining a metered time period that is worth getting sentimental over, that being the mid to late 2010s. I know I've implied that I wasn't particularly fond of that time period of internet overculture, but as I said, that element of GD's chronological displacement from mainstream culture helped it to feel so profound during that era, and I can't help but agree with the old guard of GD that it was a vastly superior time period to be playing in and engaging with its community. Whether it be linguistic idiosyncrasies, profile picture schemas, or simply the kind of less self-aware, melodramatic, and unironic attitudes that many players had towards the game back then, the idea that the past was greater and that aspects of it should be deliberately emulated in the present is one that I still find amongst competitive GD players, even in the wake of the tragic infiltration of the game as a whole by unappreciative newcomers. Now that you've been psychologically primed with that example, I hope that you'll have a greater idea as to what I'm getting at here as I transition into expounding the first causal aspect of this predisposition towards cultural reticency. And this is actually quite simple in theory. It stands to reason that one of the most, if not the single most, critical time period with regards to a game's cultural development is the one following directly in the wake of its release. When a game releases, it is going to develop a culture that is inextricably associated with its release period. even if that means nothing more than paying heed to the subconscious design philosophies that can be observed embedded within the structure of the game. Fortnite was designed for the all-encompassing span of late 2010s internet users as a collective from both a technical and design standpoint. Its low-spec computing requirements and art direction, which strikes a balance between cartoony and competitive conducive, both serve the same purpose, namely to manifest both mass appeal and a high skill ceiling. Fortnite's release conditions, primarily the fortuitous time at which it came out within the sphere of the intellectually bankrupt FPS industry as a whole, created a culture that could maintain a seemingly paradoxical duality. A culture of commodified, commercialized marketability, and on the other, a much smaller sort of archipelago among aspiring competitive players that consisted of independent visionaries developing fascinating play styles and creating montages for anyone who knew where to look. But nothing about Fortnite particularly screams toxic. Of course, I'm sure there's a sense of toxicity inherent to something like the wager community, but there's real money up for grabs there, so it's not a fair comparison. Even still, it's extremely critical to note just how much the potential for the kind of real hardcore toxicity doesn't even infrastructurally exist anymore on the internet. You think Minecraft PvP players running around with DDoS clients playing on TeamSpeak servers that unavoidably expose your public IP would have been comfortable betting thousands of dollars against each other with nothing more than a supposed social honor code stating that the loser would pay up and not exit scam? The reason I'm including Fortnite in this comparison is because I half expect to be met with counter-arguments telling me the community is extremely toxic. But if that is the case, I don't give up with the community anymore, then my point has been illustrated even further. A game's early onset culture certainly does have to do with the presiding culture of its release period. That is to say, exactly what you'd instinctively associate with the word culture itself if you weren't presently watching one of my videos. But it has perhaps less to do with that overarching cultural milieu of the time than it does with the ubiquitous and inextricable underlying conditions of the era in which it released, like hardware limitations, software vulnerabilities, contemporaneously operated computer programs and equipment, etc. This is the basis as to how the release timeframe of a game comes to maintain a direct interconnection with its community's culture. However, there is a missing puzzle piece here. The Minecraft PvP community has, for the past decade, maintained a tertiary relationship with some of the most bombastic cybercriminals ever. But how could this be? What the theory I just proposed would suggest is that in the immediate wake of a grand-scale sociological development, like, for instance, the shift from Skype and TeamSpeak, communication services that compromise and expose your IP, to Discord, which properly encrypts traffic, that the incredibly commonplace phenomenon that is petty adolescent cyber abuse would fizzle out and cease to exist. But it did not. Cybercrime is a habit that has propagated through the Minecraft PvP community through every generation of players, regardless of the increased focus on cybersecurity by the general public. No matter what the year is, the impressionable teenagers who play the game have always been just a skip away from the kind of illicit activity that exists as an open secret between players throughout the game. Herein lies the essence of cultural reticency. Motifs within a culture, if they have formerly existed at a substantial level, will continue to propagate amongst future generations of individuals who enter that culture, even if the circumstances that were necessary to facilitate them in the first place no longer exist. And I have also observed this phenomenon in MKW. For a very brief moment in episode 5, I touched upon what I called the mass psychosis obsession that high div RT players have with cheating, which certainly wasn't helped by rumors all throughout last year that there still existed a remnant exploit, but with a few months hindsight it's clear that absolutely nothing came of it. Just to be clear, I didn't believe for a moment that a single person was exploiting in reality, nor was there any credible reason to believe so, but there is technically an avenue that could be taken to the accusations in the sense that forcing the other team to do condies can have an adverse negative effect on them, seeing as they presumably feel very disrespected to be treated like cheaters and would perform over emotionally playing against those they consider to be authentic enemies, which could thereby encourage a punitive culture of accusations, but I don't think that's the case at all, especially because that kind of out-of-game uber seriousness has never been something MKW players are particularly known for. My proposed theory is far more simple. A former cultural motif within the MKW community is that of cheating, which in the pre-CTGP era was a ubiquitous concern that the player base was entirely justified to have. But even despite the massive roadblocks that have been put in place to prevent cheating ever since then, cheater paranoia is still at the forefront of RT player culture. There are plenty of communities in which a dramatic change like the CTGP anti-cheat would wipe away vestiges of the old culture, in this case the cheating culture of the WFC era. But whether it's for better or worse, in communities that first developed in the throes of the early internet, these cultural motifs will be relayed unto future generations. Before I continue, I will state that I imagine that all of this has seemed very theoretical. I think it's necessary that I interrupt the Minecraft community discussion, I'll get back to it in a moment, to highlight just how easy it is for the process of cultural retention to not occur. This is of course something I attribute to a game's release date, but it's hardly a conclusion that I came to logically. I practically consider it an ontological principle because I hate just about every culture that has arisen from a newly released video game in the past decade and a half. I'll dedicate an extended segment to MK8 next video with much of this same line of thought in mind, probably to such a similar degree that it'll seem like I'm retreading the exact same ground, but for now you need only to consider the tragically acute extent to which the culture surrounding 8U as a game, and everything that differentiates it from the contemporaneousness for its own sake, bleeding-edge, volatile immediacy that surrounds 8D's culture of sweeping meta changes and DLC overhauls, has served to wipe 8U completely off the map. Cultural reticency is not even a remotely present concept in the mind of any 8D player. Here's a fan base comprised almost exclusively of the kind of Nintendo consumers that exist in the here and now. They certainly appreciate the mechanics of the game, because they're fucking stupid, but the game itself is nothing they wouldn't put down in a heartbeat for a newer Mario Kart entry because, well, all my friends are buying it. And what do you know, that new entry doesn't need to be referred to hypothetically at all because it's right over the horizon for the low price of $80. And as such, the 8D, soon-to-be MK9 community's collective process of reckoning with toxicity mirrors just how rootless and transitory their entire existence as gamers is. There isn't a single observable difference between how the 8D community treats toxicity and how a commune of Twitter users would. A multiple month-long server-wide mute, not just a restriction, but mute for calling another player a whore, a permanent ban for repeatedly referring to your anchoring teammates as dead weight. From what I've heard, the entirety of 8D just feels like such an oppressively coercive system of toxic positivity. No clashing of egos, no real emotion behind any of the races, just typing nice one after your Japanese teammate gets first and having the message replied to with a Discord emoji of DS Wario Stadium's track preview screen. Because the 8D player base is so transient and nomadic and doesn't consider the community to be their designated long-term home or as an experience worth truly caring for at all in the grand scheme of things, their culture effectively just ends up mirroring the fragile, conformist monoculture that you'd get on every social media website everywhere. Neuroticism, conformity, punitive, power-tripping moderators, the universal themes of the communities for all games released in the 2010s or later, grim. So that is the first aspect of gaming community culture and how it pertains to toxicity, the cultural context of the game's release period. Minecraft decently exemplifies this point, but it is even more of a living paradigm for the second component of this commonality I've observed in culturally reticent communities. Take any game that you believe possesses a strong thread of cultural connection throughout its history. Now ask yourself, how often is that game updated? How frequently is the game changed by forces external to the player base's collective attempts to expand the meta? I propose that the further away that a game gets from the concept of being live service, the more potential it has to retain its culture in the long term. In every competitive gaming community I've seen whose players pride themselves on contributing to and being knowledgeable of the game in a historiographical sense, the most overwhelmingly occurring theme has been that the game does not receive updates. Like I said, this has a lot to do with 8D, and I'm sure I'll rehash every last word of this in the next video, but when it comes to Minecraft, I don't even need to look beyond a single release of a video game to illustrate my point. Every time I've spoken of Minecraft thus far in this series, it's been contextualized exclusively within the PvP sphere, but that hasn't been the dominant sub-community for almost a decade now, ever since the 1.9 update released in early 2016 and destroyed the cohesion of the Minecraft community as a whole by virtue of the fact that it deliberately restructured how PvP worked at a fundamental level, to the ultimate effect of giving it a quantifiable fun value of -9 out of 10. Ever since the 1.9 update's release, the toxic and developer unintended offshoot that was the PvP community has been unceremoniously bleeding out, being forced to play on outdated versions as updates to the game continue to distance PvPers from the broader community. And in the wake of the PvP community's massive decline, especially in the wake of the end of the honeymoon era that was COVID, now that the number of remaining 1.8 servers has really started dropping off, a noteworthy trend has started to crop up: the anti-nostalgia trend. In ideological opposition to the gratuitous approach to nostalgia that a relatively small subset of players had begun to develop in Minecraft, a group that chose to play exclusively on old versions, thereby eschewing the constant stream of asinine updates, the wider Minecraft player base responded by beginning to voice their drastic opposition to the idea of retreating to the past, essentially trying to guilt-trip people who don't enjoy the real, modern versions of the game. Herein lies the general Minecraft community's toxicity. If 8D players are mere drones that let themselves wash away with the cultural tide, modern Minecraft players are like that guy from The Matrix who sells humanity out on purpose. They can't even so much as stomach the idea that an increasingly large subset of players have foregone the endless, breathless cycle of update content. And it's such a pitiful showing watching these people try to bend over backwards to defend such needlessness. Thinking back to Minecraft's original target demographic of computer nerds in the early 2010s with an interest in cleverly produced indie games, and then further along in the game's history to the prevalence of the recalcitrant PvP community, to me it's both fascinating and depressing to think that the desires of the player base have sunk so far into currentness for its own sake, even to the degree of lashing out at those choosing to play what they personally consider a superior version. I feel the lesson to be learned from this is that there's absolutely no guarantee that a community that has stuck around will maintain an ideological connection to its former self over time. I stated that there are many communities with a tendency to retain their culture over time, but there is evidently still a factor I haven't considered yet, and that is this. There needs to be a preservation vector within the community, something that prompts the individuals within it to carry the cultural torch between generations. With that being said, which of the two considerations in the field of cultural retainment is more fundamentally important? The CT side of the MKW community is certainly worthy of being genealogically researched with this question in mind, because upon initial consideration it immediately seems to exist antithetically to the idea of any kind of long-term culture as a result of CTGP's ever-changing status as a periodically updated distribution. And you would be correct about that in a causal sense, because casuals don't seem to care at all for CTGP's history, nor do they appear to possess any theory of former eras of tracks like competitive players do. Contrarily, then, it is the competitive community's constant self-reassertion of the importance of preserving history and culture when the possibility of the disappearance of those things is probable in the face of CTGP councils haphazardly killing off tracks that they don't believe have aged well, which serves as a tragic conflict of interest for a community that so desperately does want to hold on to the culture and memories they associate with those older designs, as can be seen with the success of the legacy track list. The comp CT community's yearning not to lose what made the CTGP they grew up with special serves as that preservation vector, even despite the tangible underlying conditions seemingly predicting that the opposite would happen. It's a fascinating case study in how a community can eschew its own live service-ness and prioritize a wider sentiment of nostalgia regardless. However, to state that this is a CT community exclusive phenomenon would be to downplay how much this is inherently rooted in MKW's culture as opposed to merely the CT communities. To return to the second factor once again, just as a game like Melee can develop a chronicle of legends over its history of multiple decades, so too can the RT side of the community, because of the fact that both games are the polar opposite of live service. MKW is so broken that modders needed to step in to patch game-breaking glitches in online races, and even then the community has to decide which ones are worth incorporating into the unofficial official meta like BC Wii glitch. Similarly, I think MKW demonstrates a level of community-centeredness to such a degree that I feel that there barely exists a tangential connection amongst community members to any of Nintendo's other games when compared to other Nintendo sub-communities. And it's alongside this otherwise extant connection absent from the MKW community's consideration that I notice another noticeably absent association to the culture at large. Whereas other competitive communities, especially ones for other Nintendo games like Splatoon and AD, maintain the same relation to toxicity that the wider internet does at any given time, the MKW community has, as a result of its cultural reticency and isolation from the wider gaming world, remained steadfast in its toxic ways. The entire purpose of this video up until now has been an attempt to help you understand why this is the case. But within an internet culture that takes such a nominally anti-toxic approach, what does the difference actually look like? About a year ago, I stumbled across some drama from a community that I don't keep any tabs on, Splatoon 3. Someone on Twitter was up in arms about how some members of the team that won the 2024 World Championships had been behaving in private servers. They invoked racism and bigotry, and they were trying to get these players banned by Nintendo. This was their definition of blowing the lid off a groundbreaking exposal. And this evidence was truly staggering to witness. Half a dozen screenshots of someone calling members of another team monkeys, someone posting a photoshopped version of SpongeBob made to look Chinese, and like 2 screenshots of insensitive jokes that could legitimately be perceived as indecent. This guy responded to one of his friends tweeting "Stop Asian hate" with white supremacy. Okay. Have you ever felt unreasonably persecuted in MKW for being toxic? Well then get this. Nintendo themselves annulled the entire team's rightfully attained World Championship victory, rescinded their trophies, and manually edited them out of all of the in-game promotional material celebrating their achievement. For calling people monkeys on Discord. The most draconian system of impositional thought policing I can possibly think of. As someone who's been fortunate enough to be a part of mostly sensible communities that are largely divorced from the lowest common denominator internet morality by virtue of the antecedent cultural infrastructure that I've been talking about all video, I feel extremely grateful that I don't have to contend with any of this. It's funny to think that an MKW equivalent to this from around the same time period involved far more incriminating messages vis-a-vis the infamous HK document, and plenty of people who have migrated from other more morally modern communities called for a harsh punishment, but it was refreshing to see Aidlo receive a punishment that actually fit the crime. He was banned, although it was only for 2 weeks, which is just the response that this kind of petty drama deserves to be met with. Disavow the behavior, but don't overreact. Though, just as a thought experiment, let's say for the sake of argument that the Splatoon drama wasn't completely ridiculous. That would mean that the very limited set of avenues that toxicity can be expressed within contemporary gaming communities, i.e. ones that aren't shielded because they exist with association to time-honored cultures that haven't always been so pathetically overwrought like people in the 2020s are, will have to constantly acquiesce to this asinine, moralistically affected communal thought police force whenever people express any kind of negative emotion. Because even if they are not expressed, those negative emotions are not going to go away. They exist at the heart of any competitive game when you're on the receiving end of a loss. Not everyone channels their feelings into a stream of slurs, of course, but if players are forced to bottle them up because they're trapped in a cultural framework within which they don't feel that they can satisfyingly convey them publicly, then I predict that it is bound to escalate that toxicity from a fact of life to an unchecked phenomenon once it is forced to become an exclusively private occurrence. Though don't just take my word for it, because I am far from the first person to consider this. We're on episode 9 of the series, and I'm already deep into this video, so who knows how many hours of commentary I've rattled off in total so far, without actually making a response to someone who motivated me to create this series in the first place. I mentioned him in episode 1, but since then I've rewatched his catalog multiple more times and have never stopped gaining respect for him. Yes, I'm still not done talking about Minecraft. Hivlik was one of the all-time best Minecraft PvPers and moderator of the biggest PvP server, as well as a very articulate commentator with a great deal to say about the nature of the game. And he had a series much like this one, although it was live commentated. In episode 28 of Hivlik's ELO series, which was titled Competition and Toxicity, he talked at length about this very topic. I highly recommend watching it, even if it's just to see Hivlik playing the game, but also because I think it would be interesting to witness how he, despite being very hard on toxicity, whereas I take a stance that I didn't consider to be pro-toxicity until I realized it certainly wasn't anti-toxicity, comes to the same conclusion as I do regarding how it should be reconciled with. In the video, he makes 2 arguments, the first of which I quite agree with, and the latter of which I have mixed feelings towards. Going into 2016, the Minecraft PvP community had 2 large servers that were competing to corner the market of 1v1 practice game modes, Bad Lion and Kohi. Although Kohi would merge with Bad Lion later in the year, but that's not too relevant. The 2 servers in question are entirely unconducive to the kind of parallel drawing that I've done thus far to currently active cultures from other games, but they will be useful in illustrating a point about what teleological purpose toxicity serves. Hivlik noticed that Kohi's in-game server chat was extremely toxic as a byproduct of its lax approach to moderation, but that members of the Kohi community, in public-facing avenues like on Twitter and in Skype chats, were capable of behaving in a perfectly civilized manner. By contrast, the Bad Lion community, whose moderators took chat rules far more stringently, perhaps ended up begetting a latent set of resentment amongst a player base that may have desired to display much more toxic behavior in the server chat, but which was consistently met with incongruent punishments for comparatively minor infractions. Hivlik theorized that the Bad Lion community, which seemed to display a level of toxicity on other platforms that was completely beyond that which you'd expect from the in-game chat, had been inclined to shift its toxic behavior to those other platforms. I think a theory as to why this happens is that a hypothetical, not particularly toxic player who wants to let out some anger will be able to indulge that desire as soon as possible. Alternatively, the Bad Lion player will have presumably already learned their lesson, or will simply know that they would be muted for a while if they were to speak up, so they hold off on telling their opponent to KYS or whatever and bottle the negative emotions up. Then, when that player logs onto external platforms later, their anger has not dissipated because it still has not yet had a release outlet. But if they had, in fact, been able to express their anger immediately, it may not have been expressed so severely later on. Hivlik also presents a similar hypothesis. He states that a more preferable alternative to a network of overzealous chat moderators would be a system that can theoretically find a middle ground between too much toxicity and a lack of competition and social stakes. I know that this has a literal 100% chance of falling on deaf ears, given that I'm the only person here who's watched all of Hivlik's videos, but this is truly reflective of how brilliant his thought processes were. His ability to come to a rational and impartial decision that demonstrates a fundamental lack of bias on his part. He came to this conclusion despite moderating a toxic server chat for hours a day, dealing with cheaters and even other top players targeting him in specific on alts trying to drain his elo. But in spite of the strong personal bias against this kind of socially maladaptive behavior that you would imagine he would have, he couldn't help but feel that this balanced approach was still the right way to move forwards. It's certainly the position that I personally take, and it's also one that is upheld at least in an unspoken sense amongst high-tier players on both track types in MKW, whose respective staff members tend to be empathetic to this position because they've been steeped in MKW's culture for so long. With all of this in mind, it's important to note that MKW is, in broader terms, an island. Minecraft was a product of its time as per the collective irreverence of unchecked mid-2010s internet communities, but it's been 10 years and the state of the Minecraft community is completely unrecognizable, thereby beginning a disposition towards toxicity that represents that status as a fragmented, deracinated product of its universally recognized environment. Institutions that operate in this idealized intermediate moderation way are by no means common on the wider internet, and those that do still exist most likely have just as much of an entrenched cultural lineage as MKW does. I do believe that these kinds of communities should be praised wherever they are encountered, but the nature of their cultural estrangement from collective 2020s morality means that they will unfortunately be more difficult to find and assimilate yourself into, seeing as the strongest defense mechanisms against the worst aspects of presently existing culture are predominantly possessed by communities with such a holistic respect for and gratuitous appreciation of their origins, meaning you'll inevitably have a hard time as a newcomer trying to come to a comprehensive understanding of these communities as cultures. Additionally, since such attitudes towards toxicity have fallen out of favor, those kinds of communities will probably also be much less popular because if they were more recognized, they would have had to deal with the assimilation of contemporary values that I've been harping on about, thereby sublimating those pre-existing community values while in fact not demonstrating any respect for that community's heritage. Suffice it to say, the kinds of games that do maintain traditions steeped within a greater tolerance for toxicity don't pose any threat, so to speak, to the moralistic factions that govern the vast majority of online gaming today, but not so much for the other way around. There are a lot of places I could go with this, one more than noteworthy cultural climate having to do with the Orwellian policies that the corporations behind games like Valorant take towards voice chat moderation, but I instead want to zero in on the two models I've recognized in the realm of chat filters in competitive online games. A completely open, no-holds-barred chat system is frankly an inherently bad idea, even if you in particular don't personally apply any moral value judgments to the concept because others will. Regardless of how you spin it, it's simply bad for business because if the scrutiny of the general public happens to fall upon you, you'll be on the receiving end of attacks from both bad actors who seek to abuse the system and concerned outsiders who want it shut down. However, there exists a spectrum of chat moderation severity adjacent to this that maintains an inherent defense: stringent chat filters with strict punishments in lieu of case-by-case moderation done by humans. The poster child for this kind of system is a Minecraft PvP server that has come to take the place of the 1.7 old guard called Minemen Club. It's far less active, but with an accompanying silver lining that is a feeling of centralization, which didn't exist in PvP's heyday. It's worth taking a look at because it is, if the moderation level of servers were to be viewed on a sliding scale, perhaps the closest to zero you'll encounter in practice, whether that be with regard to its toxic chat or Minecraft's omnipresent cheater epidemic. Both its chat, which goes almost completely unmoderated, as well as its anti-cheat system, exist only to give the relatively lazy administrators the excuse that they've implemented some attempt at a solution. As far as anti-cheat goes, you'll be banned quickly for using blatant cheats, but moderately intelligent ghost client users can go unflagged indefinitely, and the same goes for the chat filter. In order to account for the disparity, and to provide a sense of plausible deniability, the automatic punishments for violating the chat blacklist are extremely severe. Whereas most servers will prevent your message from being sent if they contain blacklisted words, Minemen Club blocks the message and mutes you depending on what you typed for up to a few weeks. The premise of a relatively unmoderated chat, albeit with a rigorous word blacklist, is also the one that's effectively been in place for most of Lounge's history, although without as much subsequent punishment unless you're a very frequent offender. I think it was Baked Bean who spammed N-words under the assumption they were all being sent to the Shadow Realm only to find himself muted because staff were mad that their deleted message log was being spammed with paragraphs full of slurs. Most people, though, will garner nothing more than a sporadic sequence of 5-minute mutes over time because they didn't know that words like autistic were on the blacklist, as well as the more controversial term retard. As someone who is a card carrier in both categories, I'm surprised that people haven't made a bigger fuss about this kind of thing yet. I think one of the 2010s precedents for words pertaining to the autism spectrum / domain of mental handicaps being blacklist worthy is that UT Sane, the one that made the Improvement Movement series, had a brother who was cognitively impaired, and given that Sane was a staff member for a while, he pushed to ensure the word would be blacklisted. Sane himself has always been very highly esteemed amongst the community, so his wishes were respected. Of course, it's been many years since then, and so I can ascribe the purported reason why we haven't seen a mass word blacklist purge as no one wanting to go down as the ARB that's okay with people spamming retard, apart for one opposing figure who I'll get to. But if the only obstacle in the way of someone who truly wants to be toxic is an easily circumventable restriction filter, this oversight creates a loophole for toxicity, the verbose insult or creative insult philosophy. If you type KYS in Lounge Chat, your message will be deleted by Judge Dreadbot, and you may be restricted if Lounge staff notice that you continually attempt to say the phrase. Going slightly further, if you bypass that by telling someone to KY5 like Desea or circumvent the filter in some other way, you'll be restricted for filter bypassing. And with that, I've now introduced the second chat filter archetype, one with a greater deal of freedom in the auto-moderation department, but one in which users contend with an omnipresent manual human moderation system that will take notice of infractions. Obviously, Lounge does not meet this definition, seeing as I just got done explaining how the opposite of an unmitigated chat system is what is actually in place, but this system is meant to illuminate how Lounge incorporates aspects of both. I suppose you could call it a third kind of system. On Badlion, at certain points in the server's history, you could type anything in the chat, including the N-word or whatever else. There are videos on the server with hundreds of thousands of views where people can even be seen getting muted for it. And in the instances of both it and Lounge, what players learn to do in order to continue being as toxic as possible without being punished follows the same pattern. Recognizing that the system and its moderators do not exist within a framework that precludes toxic sentiment from being espoused, but rather only targets products of it. The most baseline, instinctual, primitive expressions of anger. And in this case, given every instance of skirting the rationale behind a rule set witnessed in other communities, it should be easy to imagine how this will manifest in Lounge's environment. when the sentiment behind a message is, by nature of the rule set and by the actually enforced moderation standards, considered less of an infringement than any arbitrary key phrases that may cause you to find yourself auto-muted for a few minutes, then we once again find ourselves back at that latent susceptibility. Something that Hivlik said in his video on Toxicity that made me realize how idealistic he was is that he believed the spirit of a message, if it were possible to ascertain, is what should truly warrant the severity of a punishment. Randomly interjecting a dead chat with KYS means nothing, strictly speaking, but messaging your opponent after a match, GG, easy, you're terrible, is indicative of a genuinely socially maladaptive mentality. And while I disagree that mere insult to injury, or lashing out momentarily in the event of the shoe being on the other foot, really justifies such an aggressive punishment, although, upon further thought, it's hard to come up with a more coherent argument against that line of thought, I still believe that more stringent moderation standards are the last thing I'd want to see in a broader cultural sense. Regardless, I'd like to talk about a phenomenon wherein people who have technically broken no rules can express far more toxicity than those who may find themselves frequently restricted. I'll start with an introductory instance of this concept that isn't particularly toxic to give you a general idea. If you've played CT High Tier with Ruko and LU, then you'll know that he sometimes sends seemingly incomprehensible messages after the races sometimes, namely something like help me or some general term like dog shit or obsessed. The idea is that the message, because it was sent without any context and he didn't mention anyone in particular, will be interpreted preeminently by the target in question, which will serve to make the target feel alienated because they're being singled out by a message that the other players in chat assign no meaning to. The real beauty, though, is that everyone is caught on by now to how Ruko operates, which means that every time he sends one of his trademark Rukoisms in chat, there are bound to be at least a few people who wonder if his cryptic messages are supposed to be directed at them or not. It would be way more Kafka-esque if not for the fact that it's really just hilarious when you know that both of the given shock users in a race are wondering if his message, how'd that shock work out for you, was intended for them or not. Ruko also isn't known to engage in any wanton griefing, seeing as his cries for help from his teammates are ultimately a recognizable byproduct of not wanting to lose, so he's ultimately quite inoffensive. Before moving on to the more necessarily toxic incarnation of non-rule-breaking toxicity, I want to note what makes Ruko's approach to what he does work so well. I was originally going to structure this segment more linearly, but I can't think of a better juncture in the commentary to introduce this, so here's another complimentary James U.S. tangent about, you'll never guess, something adjacent to the wider evolution of internet culture. Ruko might be an MKW player, but his methodology is so unintentionally genius that it could very easily be transposed into a far less tolerant culture and still function perfectly. That is to say that even within the chronologically recent phenomenon of communities that have the most draconian sense of what qualifies as punishment-worthy toxicity, the specific brand of slickly delivered, compact, intrinsically plausibly deniable toxic quips that Ruko uses to subtly psychologically impact people exists within an area that can't be zeroed in on as an egregiously offensive pattern of behavior. And it's because of how unwittingly and disproportionately genius this somewhat unassuming approach is that it makes me confident that I can predict the future of toxicity in modern gaming. Openly secret in-jokes have already been a pattern of behavior in MKW for a while. Even the most salacious example of JX using CPNS tag in RT Lounge is the kind of thing you'd be hard-pressed not to find a comparable case to within a given time frame in a given tier in Lounge. You just either don't notice because most people don't hyperanalyze inside jokes amongst friend groups they're not a part of, or overlook them if they do happen to catch on because you're presumably a conventional, culturally aligned MKW player who doesn't get their panties in a twist over that kind of thing. Although something like that is a more exaggerated example, it still relates to my theory as to what toxicity will look like on the internet in the future. This is an idea that is easier to get across to the MKW community because of how similar customs of behavior have developed within it. There's a lot of tacit, passive-aggressive antagonization that goes on in chats all across the community, so what you see on a daily basis within your Discord chats may just be reflective of what will come to pass in the gaming communities of the future once the kind of harsh approaches to toxicity that I've witnessed in communities like 8Ds become more commonplace as the monocultural needle continues to press further. And I propose that the range of mechanisms by which this will take place will correspond closely with Ruko's feasibly deniable avenue of expressing toxicity. I think the future of packaging socially incorrect ideas is going to involve just the same kind of acronyms, euphemisms, and delicate references like the ones that MKW players are already familiar with. Because sociological conditions are only clamping down harder and harder on antisocial and toxic ideas as time goes on, any kind of punishment-inducing nonconformity is going to have to bend in this direction in order for it to be expressed at all. You either learn to play it subtly, disguise your jokes as clan tags and gifts from the Discord search bar, or you'll be stuck raging in private chats forever with no way of imparting the anger onto your opponents. This then begs the question, though, what if you forego all of the motifs and discrete symbols of toxicity but still fully embody the zeitgeist of it? No allusions to people killing themselves or any kind of discrimination, but extremely socially hostile and aggressive nonetheless. You'd end up with something like what I witnessed in the past when some RT players from a clan I won't name used to play CT events. Constantly disrupting and trolling, trying to get events cancelled, trying to bend or break the rules, and so on. But events can be disrupted at the fault of nobody, and they can cancel for flippant reasons as well. Everybody's had an event that they were excited to play after pulling a good teammate only to wait half an hour in a room that never starts. The real pathology of this unnamed group and other groups like them that have intermittently appeared is how they behave socially. Perhaps the most important unspoken rule when dealing with any griefing group in Lounge is to never be the first person to call them out. It's a bad idea to openly antagonize them at all, no matter which way you spin it, given the fact you'll likely be full targeted, but you'll also find yourself at the epicenter of jokes and made a fool of in front of the entire chat. I need to reiterate that this isn't a social justice crusade and that I'm only not a saint but have also been an unapologetic contributor to this kind of behavior in the past. But I feel that it's here where Hivlik's belief that the sentiment of the toxicity that is expressed by a person or group should outweigh what is literally said starts to sound far more prescient. In order to understand why I think this way, let's consider the fundamental rationale behind moderating toxicity in the first place. Your primary goal as someone overseeing the moderation system behind a game is to ensure that people can have an experience in your game that isn't marred by unnecessary harassment. I could go off on a tangent about how there's a potential conflict of interest here given that different people desire different levels of moderation and how a player's goal may not always be to avoid being on the receiving end of toxicity because perhaps they enjoy the feeling of knowing they've made their opponents angry, but as far as this question goes, the only concern here is whether the manifestation of the presumably existent attempts to achieve that goal have prevented toxicity. 1,000 people can type hateful messages and there's a chance that every last one of them will have been a joke and that a given chat filter will simply have identified false positives, but messages sent with an unsportsmanlike spirit that are targeted specifically at an individual can result in just the same level of distress as a blacklisted term and arguably much more. Not everyone may agree, but I consider this non-immediately sanctioned toxicity much worse on an emotional level than a mere no-no word precisely because of the sentiment behind it. And it stands to reason that these toxic messages with a strong negative emotional impact to the victim fall within the realm of what should ostensibly be punished within a properly functioning moderation system, otherwise that system would be failing. And there does exist an avenue by which recuperance can be sought. It's called a ticket system. but although it should exist and is all but necessary to have in order to maintain stability in the server when the sanctity of the rules is flagrantly disrespected, the success you'll have with this is firstly dependent on to what extent you're experiencing in-game harassment, since being griefed is concrete whereas Discord microaggressions aren't, and secondly is going to be limited to temporary restrictions if you do happen to prove your case, something you may not be able to do or feel coerced into not even attempting to do in the first place in the event that you're aware the people in the group that's attacking you have some kind of connection on staff. In any circumstances, your ticket would be a Pyrrhic victory anyways that would probably only provoke the behavior more. If the subjects of your ticket get restricted and can guess it was you, which certainly wouldn't take a rocket scientist to be able to do, your experience can just as easily escalate from the unfortunate selection as an arbitrarily chosen target by people who came to grief anyways and didn't have anything out for you in particular, to a long-term grudge with greater consequences. So many wasted sentences by me over the course of this section to present an already prevalent unspoken thought that toxicity in Lounge cannot be avoided and that attempts to mitigate it are fruitless when its tenets exist as ubiquitous notions within MKW's culture. And as I've stated, I'm not anti-toxicity myself. This entire video is never for the purpose of trying to call out toxicity, but just to explore it. If anything, my remarks upon how the incidental experience of dealing with griefers on CTs years ago is incredibly hypocritical of me, considering that RN played the game while sitting in group calls for years, the only difference being that we weren't there to grief, usually. The kind of people that would experience just one or two uncompetitive events and feel demotivated are the kind who would have washed out of Lounge's atmosphere anyways. Just refer to that video from late 2023 of that one chick who got depressed from playing RT Tier 1 for a month, even though she documented the majority of people being quite kind and welcoming despite the fact she was on meme mock bike averaging 30 every event. Irrespective of whether or not you objectively have a good or bad experience, you will need to ultimately construct a framework for yourself that you can exist within and which can facilitate healthy responses to toxicity as you play MKW and engage with the community. Because at some point or another, the inevitability of encountering hostile behavior will become evident, and you'll need to have a strong personal foundation that you can rely upon so that these experiences won't dishearten you. However, I believe that attaining this ideal mental paradigm, one that can help you manage the toxicity you'll encounter very frequently, is a mental bridge that must be consciously crossed and requires at least a limited understanding, even if that's just subconscious, of the many intertwined and far-reaching factors that go into why the MKW community is the way that it is. If I'm correct about this, then perhaps that's why some people are simply incapable of ever deriving a true appreciation of playing competitively, given how much of an implicit weight to bear is placed upon you, the individual, as it pertains to holistically accepting the culture of the game that you're presented with. And just as players need to learn this lesson in order to be able to engage with the community properly, I imagine that Lounge staff have also had to come to terms with how their player base approaches toxicity. Throughout Lounge's history, and particularly over the course of the past few years, sporadic top-down efforts by the powers that be to stop toxicity have always been a humorous recurring theme. Whether it be the ominous out-of-the-blue announcement that toxicity will be cracked down upon very heavily in late 2022, which was seemingly never contributive to anything and seems in retrospect to be a remnant of some nascent backroom MK Central deal that went nowhere back then. I could be here all day detailing how the methodology towards applying restrictions has changed, but I'll spare you the details by painting the broad strokes before I zero in on one chronicle. To make a long story short, there's been a there and back again oscillation in terms of restrictions over Lounge's history. When restrictions were first implemented, it was quite rare to see people with them, but those who did receive restrictions found themselves facing quite long-term punishments. A few years back, over the first few years of the decade, I recall it getting quite bad with a sort of double whammy scenario wherein minor offenses would both incur a restriction but also result in the same kind of punishment that more serious offenses would. which incidentally resulted in a few so-called indefinite restrictions. But Lounge staff's aggressive focus on lengthy restriction times has seemingly calmed down as of 2023 and 2024, and even that atmosphere of feeling slightly surveilled in non-highest tier chats hardly feels threatening. You may still wake up to a restriction for a GIF you posted 24 hours ago, but it won't be for long and is entirely dependent on whether individual over-enthusiastic arbitrators decide to read a chat's message history. To be honest, things have been quite serviceable recently, and I've been glad to see it as the rest of the internet continues to fall over itself trying to police people's behavior. I think the instance that demonstrated just how incongruent that kind of methodology is when applied to the MKW community was with perhaps the shortest-lived rule set overhaul in early 2024, when the restriction system, in markedly different fashion to the usual empty claims of meaningfully overhauling it, removed entirely and replaced with a system of mutes exclusively, with otherwise restriction-worthy offenses resulting in short mute periods that scaled up the more times you were muted. The system didn't last long enough for this to ever happen, but there were even rumors of perma-mutes if you were recidivist enough. And before long, the entire system was rolled back. So much effort, both in terms of changing server permissions as well as the planning phase of the restructure, and yet it was entirely dispensed of, becoming nothing more than another forgotten period, barely even important enough to be an iceberg entry if I didn't need to commentate this for over an hour. But as for this footnote, I propose that it's MKW's culture that has an immunizing mechanism against this specific brand of dictated paradigm shift. Of course, it would be entirely possible to redefine a long-term rule set that succeeds by virtue of having the faintest bit of thought put in, seeing how illogical a one-size-fits-all mutes-only system is by any metric. But in execution, as far as MKW culture goes, a punishment framework overbearing and influential enough to change the way that MKW players behave would have to be far more impositional than anything that has been attempted thus far. The way this failed rule set was implemented felt almost laughably harmless, almost as if it were inviting the same kind of behavior that would supposedly prompt these trivial short-term mutes. The wannabe intimidation tactic of promising a permanent mute for hardcore repeat offenders may as well have been a challenge for certain undesirables looking to embarrass the staff by forcing them to uphold their own asinine rule sets. The thing is that MKW players with any sense of self-respect are aware that their culture and customs are far more deep-seated and deserve much more respect than all those contemporary communities that implement binary punishment systems with no pushback like 8D because their entire player base is feckless and they've all only ever spent time in communities where policing minor offenses is perceived to be of paramount importance. And so people protested, not in a cringeworthy, raucous, fuck the staff way, but rather by simply continuing on as they always had and not holding their tongue even if that meant tanking a mute. With nobody deterred from the toxicity they were continuing to express, the mutes-only system's unsustainability became immediately apparent. The lounge community's default behavior disproved the possibility of its compatibility with any such framework. With that being said, though, lounge players have just so happened to have found equilibrium in the recent past through fortuitous good grace, but there's no guarantee that things will stay that way. I'm sure you can all guess what the concluding topic will be with that line of thought now in mind, but I first have something to say as to what happens when those sociological implications of the wider internet that I have been referencing breaks through the MKW community's collective community ideology. And it's a crucial juncture that took place in the past which illustrates how technically indeterminate our moderation system is as a community. It's from around the time of the second iteration of the MK6 ladder server, the first one being from December of 2020 and the one in question being from early 2023 after another one of Frozen's bans. I'm decently confident that the server didn't play a single event, thereby making it a complete failure compared to its predecessor, but what's worth mentioning is the conflict of interest that arose amongst the staff in the immediate wake of its creation. You see, Rob was the owner of both servers, and this apparent insubordination caused staff of the official lounge server to demand his resignation as owner, stating that someone with such split priorities couldn't be fit for the position going forwards. Of course, he could have kicked the entire staff team, but Rob instead chose to honorably step down from server owner. We can all be grateful that Rob didn't choose to burn bridges on the way out, but the lounge staff's reaction seems inevitable in hindsight, and I'm sure he could have also predicted that it may have gone down this way beforehand, which begs the question, why'd he take such a proactive stance in heading the 2023 ladder server? It's because Rob is very convicted on the subject of chat-related punishments, or to be specific, the lack of them. Rob was the single most pro-free speech staff member and felt that he had been hindered by lounge staff in his efforts to promote a less punitive moderation system, most notably the incredibly short-lived, even further down iceberg entry that was the 24-hour period where Judge Dredd's filter got cleared and people could say anything, even including the hard R. So Rob considered Ladder V2 to be his way of giving the community a no-holds-barred free speech alternative. But just as the new server itself was dead on arrival, Rob inadvertently killed his own ideology alongside it. I believe the moral of the story is that the interstice between the old and new internet that the MKW community figuratively exists within is by no means something to be taken for granted. I feel as if the majority of people instinctively understand that there exists a careful equilibrium of freedom of expression counterbalanced by the strong moderation standards usually endemic to Nintendo communities, but as a result it goes completely understated, which means that when anyone starts getting ideas, there is a lot more potential to disrupt this delicate system. I don't want to make it seem like I'm being critical of Rob at all, because he did have good intentions, and the freedom of speech that he stood for is precisely the kind of strong virtue that MKW's moderators would ideally be upholding if the game existed in a cultural bubble. But despite how compartmentalized the competitive MKW community may seem from an overarching perspective, that is not actually the truth, nor could it ever be. And to further illustrate how delicate this equilibrium is, I have another cautionary tale to exhume, and it's one that I'm glad I found a way to sneak into this video. It makes me feel much better that I have an excuse to talk about it, because I was having second thoughts making this episode so long initially. This is what happened to Sam Baller Rose. Sam has always been someone with a fascinating internet presence. The fact that his full real name was never a secret made digging into his past extremely easy for everyone who has ever looked to mess with him in the past, but around mid-2023 he decided to join in on the hardcore trolling himself by inventing what I deem to be an entirely new, culturally acontextual brand of humor. In my own personal attempts at developing a limited cultural genealogy of the 21st century internet in my mind, I've found that I always end up gravitating to distinctly novel milieus, especially ones that really push the envelope in terms of acceptable behavior. Whether it be the violent soundboard prank calls of the late 2000s, the rise of irreverent and iconoclastic gaming let's plays in the early 2010s, and, in the case of Sam, a very absurd and eccentric set of linguistic motifs that he used in the development of a standard of humor that was equally as toxic as it was bizarre, infinitely self-referential and repetitive, with constant references to words like rape and dog and censor-bypassing terminology that invoked the names of contemporary players and clans. It's honestly fascinating to me in the sense that it could quite literally only exist in MKW. Any other community wouldn't have the prerequisite level of social cohesion or would cast a wide enough net of behavioral standards to quickly stamp out any weird kind of nonconformism, but Sam took advantage of Lounge's comparatively lax standards and was always just crafty and eccentric enough to get by the chat moderation standards to avoid getting restricted. Over time, as he continued to go unpunished, Sam would ramp up his behavior more and more, even finding himself briefly Weemfi banned and needing to continually rely on his arbitrator connections to avoid being restricted. However, strictly speaking, Sam was navigating the margins of the rule set perfectly. Despite how proximal his jokes were to mute-worthy or ban-worthy conduct, he could have technically continued on just as he had without escalating any further. But then, in December of 2024, he uploaded a video that doomed his MKW comedian career completely. The video was ostensibly intended as an inside joke for his friends as well as anyone else who may have stumbled across it, and it featured him explaining the origin of each type of joke he would make on a regular basis while staying in his conventional, lighthearted character. The only problem being the fact he referred to himself as the rapist while behaving out of pocket all throughout. I re-uploaded it on my alt since he deleted it, and it's in the resources section if you'd like to see it for yourself, but I'm keeping it unlisted because of what transpired after it was originally posted. I mentioned that Sam had a traceable online presence for a reason. Not only was he indefinitely banned from the community for inappropriate conduct, but someone even emailed the video to his college where he was promptly expelled. All of this from someone who, immediately prior to his ban, wasn't even restricted in Lounge. Sam's critical mistake was taking his favorable circumstances for granted. His humor was tolerable enough to be passed over despite being a constant factor because he took time to preemptively reconsider prior to each time he would really choose to push the envelope, but the moment he got carried away, he was immediately hit with the nuclear option. I feel that it's this instance above all that personifies the narrow equilibrium that the MKW community maintains. When it comes to evaluating behavioral infractions, the same amount of credence is given to MKW's history and culture as it is to the standards of the ever-encroaching contemporary internet. It's entirely possible to adeptly maneuver this system to your own benefit so that you can sidestep any repercussions, just like Sam did for many months. But there's a social fabric that makes up the community, and it's gravely threatened when people try to overstep for the sake of overstepping. The way I see it, one of the most destructive kinds of instances for the community as a whole is whenever outside attention is brought to any kind of toxicity present in MKW. It's not because I'm concerned with MKW's palatability from the perspective of a prospective normative cultural hegemony. You could argue that a larger Mario Kart community that may have wanted to assimilate the MKW community would deny it on the grounds of the supposedly ubiquitous toxicity issue, but that's a moot point anyways, because not only is being assimilated not an intrinsically good thing, but that larger conglomerate would most likely be looking for reasons to exert its influence anyways. Even if the community were slightly less toxic at this very moment, its reputation would still precede it with visions of things like Claw's Me in the 2020 World Cup Finals, and from there the goalposts would simply move backwards for the sake of providing a more convenient excuse to encroach upon MKW's comparatively scaled-back approach and make it more like all the other modern Nintendo game communities no matter how people act. No, the reason is because the exoteric form that the MKW community will inevitably take in the mind of any presently frequently online internet user, in the event that these evidently nonconformist and distasteful behaviors are witnessed, an image that is so transgressive that it all but forces the hand of the unsettled postmodernist moralistic observer to do something, whether that be to call out the community to a limited extent on social media or whatnot, to, if this person is taking a more active involvement in the community beyond mere spectatorship, proclaiming there reflexively came to conclusion that a formal structural reform is somehow a necessary and pertinent solution to allaying the alleged social maladjustment of the community. Sam's endeavors were tolerated for quite a while by virtue of the very nature of MKW's social fabric, built upon all of those intrinsically absorbed subtle foundational influences, which is something I think he was entirely aware of given the infinite self-referentiality and aspect of iterative meta-ness that underlined it all. It represents a kind of stand against the vast majority of online gaming communities where even the faintest deviation from so-called normal, superficial compliance would beget punishments just like Sam's university expulsion, and most people wouldn't even see it as particularly unjust. For the sake of maintaining this fortunate distinction that we have from all the rest of the internet, it's important that people don't abuse the implicit permission that they're given in the MKW community to be more toxic and otherwise unconventional, because when this trust is repeatedly exploited in the long run, it serves the tragically ironic purpose of making the community one step less removed from all of those other overbearing subcultures. In light of all that, MKW may just end up in that reality. For the past 3 years, the community has been strung along with the promise of a new forum to succeed MK boards, one that would be constituted with embedded legitimacy from the outset as a result of its association with the much larger 8D community. Twitch and YouTube channels were renamed, GSC partnered up, empty promises were intermittently issued, but not a single substantial event took place until this year. I already talked about this in episode 5, the website in question is MK Central. And seeing as I already gave a sort of limited psychoanalysis on the AD community already, there's no need to retread old ground. The site's guidelines for behavior are exactly in line with the intolerant year 202X subcultures I've already invoked 50 times in this video with slightly different phrasing each time. I think the conduct guidelines for this site need no further explanation. But as of this month, the merge is finally seeing an actual tangible development, since league registrations will now be running on their website, though something far more pivotal is happening as a byproduct of the merge: the consolidation of all 3 of the major online Mario Kart communities into one collective. I'm including MK9 in this alongside 8D and Wii, although it hasn't released yet. I imagine plenty of people are grateful to see what seems like a logical development of the scene into something united, especially with access to the 8D community's seemingly endless supply of talented web devs and programmers, but as far as the scope of this video goes, I have to raise my concern. There's historically been a fortuitous breach between the 8D community and the MKW community that's allowed us to simultaneously do our own thing without constant sanctimonious observation, while also displaying whatever kind of impudent attitude towards the 8D lounge staff that we feel like. I know a few people who've been punished or even perma-muted for griefing in there. Being that 8D has always been compartmentalized, even back in the time it spent during the doomed MK boards era, punishments never carried over, so MKW players would occasionally pop in to grief a few events before they got whatever they had coming to them on that side. No, not to imply that there's any legitimate argument in favor of the needless griefing of a community that merely wants to play its own game, but there's a potentially disastrous trajectory that this new Mario Kart network could take now that it's trying to incorporate a community that doesn't gel with the behavioral standards of the other two. And I already have a reason to be concerned. Let's return to the topic of Sam's ban. There was a rumor going around at the time of the ban that the push to make it indefinite was primarily spearheaded by a single person. Over the course of this year, we've gotten glimpses into the MK Central rollout, and one trace of what was to come got people talking. Enter Ilana, someone who's been a frequent subject of trolling for unnecessarily expressing her political beliefs on Twitter and elsewhere. Through her connections to various D1 players and staff members, she managed to silently get her hands on an uncolored and otherwise inconspicuous role in the lounge server with the ominous title of MK Central staff, all during the same general time frame as Sam's ban. And given that Sam was no stranger to trying to slyly include her in his audacious jokes, there's even one on-screen all throughout his explanation video, that mystery seems solved if it wasn't guaranteed to be an indefinite ban in the first place, that is. Though right after saying that, I'd like to immediately transition the topic away from Ilana herself, not just for the sake of not wanting to single out a specific person, but also because she isn't inherently important in the context of this broader ongoing situation. It was only necessary to mention Ilana because she represents what I believe the MK Central staff team may desire with regards to MKW's moderation once the game is integrated into the site's nascent overarching ecosystem. That is to say, moderators who take a very harsh approach to dealing with toxicity and won't need to undergo any kind of cultural integration with the 8D and MK9 communities because they already represent the values of those communities to a T. And if that really is the truth, then there's no telling what may be in store for MKW players going forwards. The delicate equilibrium of the MKW community's behavioral standard is, as I've taken no half measures in delineating throughout this video, something steeped in the historical context of the internet itself, as well as the sociological development of gaming subcultures, and in my opinion deserves a level of inherent respect equivalent to all of the countless influences that have made a mark on it throughout this game's storied history. After having spent 2 months on this video, that hope for cultural respect is what I ultimately leave off upon. There's a chance that MK Central's involvement will ruin the social side of the community and turn the competitive MKW scene into just another intellectually inert subculture, but I think either way there's realistically a much greater possibility that MKW players will continue to be themselves just as they always have, completely irrespective of whether they're subjected to an overbearing standard of behavior or not. Like I said, I think that power to maintain community tradition under any circumstances is the most fundamental to greatness within the fleeting culture of the internet, and it's also that which truly contributes to a sense of community at all, to represent something that's worthwhile. And with that, I have at long last ran out of things to say. Thank you for watching if you watched absolutely any portion of this jumbled mess. Hopefully the next video will be released within a human time frame, but that's all I have for now, so goodbye.